And welcome Pastor as he comes to bring the word.
Ezekiel 38, I'm just going to scan this first 3 verses or 4 verses. God told Ezekiel to prophesy and to turn his face against Gog and Magog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshach and Tubal, and prophesy against him and tell him, I'm against thee, O Gog, chief prince of Meshach and Tubal. I will turn thee back, and I'll put hooks in your jaws and bring you forth. Hooks in the jaws. Most Americans have no or little understanding of the Muslim religion, its origin, agenda, methods. Islam, from the beginning, was a warrior code. They had an agenda of world conquest. And you better understand this. Muslims hate Jews, they hate Christians, and they hate pagans. And to them, a pagan is anyone who does not accept and believe the Muslim religion. They're barbaric. They can cut the heads off of babies with a shovel and force the mama to watch. They can stab pregnant women in the abdomen to kill their babies. They can rape women and leave their naked bodies laying in the streets dead. Muhammad, the founder of Islam, he was born in 570 AD. I had to go back and do some research. But he was a warrior, a king, and a prophet. And he was brutal. If you want to read about brutality, just read about Muhammad. And in this country, we have multitudes of young people, mostly college and some high schools, that are protesting against Israel and wanting them to get away and leave, let Hamas do whatever they want to do. That's just beyond my belief system. And we have a congresswoman standing in front of Congress talking to a crowd of protesters, tears running down her face, ranting and raving about how wicked and evil Israel is, and we've got to protect Hamas. I don't get it. You will never understand the world turmoil, and especially what's going on in the Middle East, without a scriptural, prophetic perception. The war in the Middle East is a religious war. It's called a jihad. It's an open, bloody conflict between the 2 sons of Abraham. That's where it started. Ishmael and Isaac. What happened? God had told Abraham, promised him a son. Well, Abraham's old. He's 100 years old. Sarah, his wife, is 90. And she knows she's well past the childbearing years. So she comes up with a plan. I'll give Hagar, my maidservant, to Abraham, and he can have a child, and God will keep his promise. He'll give him a son. So that's what happened. Abraham and Hagar had a son. They named him Ishmael. Well, lo and behold, now Sarah she's expecting. She's old. She can't be having babies. But she had a son, and they named him Isaac. And Ishmael was older, and he was always picking on, fighting, beating him up, Isaac up. Finally, Sarah goes to Abraham and said, this has got to stop. You've got to get rid of him. So Abraham got a promise from God that he would make Ishmael the father of many nations. And he sent them away. So Ishmael became the founder and the father of all of the Arab nations, except Israel. Now stay with me. I'm going to give you a quick overview. I don't know how quick it's going to be. Of Ezekiel 38 and 39. And God told Ezekiel to prophesy that he was against Gog and Magog, and that there would be a confederation of nations attack Israel. And he called these nations the armies of the north. Now you need to get that, the armies of the north. Ezekiel saw this series of events from the rebirth of Israel. Now that's where it starts. That's where his vision starts. So watch. That happened, the rebirth of Israel happened on May 14, 1948. They became a nation. They had been scattered to all the nations of the world. And this rebirth, Ezekiel saw a sequence of events from the rebirth of Israel as a nation up through the battle of Armageddon. Armageddon is at the end of the 7-year tribulation. Now, what confuses people is that there are 2 battles talked about in Ezekiel 38 and 39. If you try to make it one battle, you'll never get it straight. Prophets often saw what I call mountaintops or mountain peaks of events that were going to happen. But they didn't see the valleys or the time frame between these events. In prophecy, it's called the gap. They didn't see the gap or the time frame between the events that they saw. There are 2 battles. The battles with the armies of the north and the battle of Armageddon, which is at the end of the 7-year tribulation. It's important that you understand that. Ezekiel 38, Israel's back in their own land, surrounded by enemies. And I think there's a map that we can show that shows the position and what's going on around them, the nations that are there. They're surrounded by enemies. In verse 4, God said he would put hooks in their jaws and bring them in the jaws of the enemy, the armies of the north, and bring them against Israel, whether they wanted to or not. That's the first battle, the armies of the north. Now, verse 8 says that after many days are in the latter days, last days. Verse 16 says the latter days are the last days. That this Meshach and Tubal that he was to prophesy against, they were the grandsons. Now listen, Meshach and Tubal were the grandsons of Noah through Noah's son Japheth. And they settled in the areas north of the Black Sea, in the area of Russia and Ukraine. That's where they settled. Now, Tubal is Turkey. Is there a map that can show the position of Israel, if you can? See the position where they are. Ezekiel 39, God brings the armies of the north to destroy Israel, but the armies of the north are the ones that get destroyed. Verse 9 says, talks about the extent of the damage. The abandoned war material will provide fuel for Israel for 7 years. Now, I don't know what this war material is made out of, but it's going to burn for 7 years. 7 years, listen, is the exact time frame of the tribulation. God is going to protect a certain number of Jews and provide for them through the tribulation period. There'll be 12,000 from each one of the tribes, 144,000 that he will preserve and protect. And verse 12 says it takes 7 months to bury the dead from the battle. This is what I believe. You don't have to agree with me, and probably there are many that won't. But I believe this battle with the armies of the north is going to mark the rapture of the church and the beginning of the 7 years tribulation. The 7 years tribulation is going to be between these two battles. Two battles. Battles with the army of the north, and in chapter 39, verse 17 through 22, is the battle of Armageddon. Now, I'm trying to give you this so you can get it positioned in your mind. 7 years of tribulation between the two battles. That's what I believe. That's the gap. All you have to do is compare the second battle that Ezekiel prophesied about. Compare that to verses describing the battle of Armageddon in Revelations 19. You compare it, it's almost word for word, the same description. Now that means if what I'm saying is true, and that's the only thing I can see, that means there's a 7-year gap between verse 16 and verse 17 in Ezekiel 39. The battle with the armies of the north is at the beginning of the tribulation. I believe that will be the rapture. And the battle with the kings of the earth at the end of the tribulation. So the battle with the kings of the north is the first battle. The battle with the kings of the earth is the second battle, and there's 7 years difference between them. Does that make any sense? Okay, stay with me now. We're going to get a little more serious. The Bible is the only religious book of any religion in the world that dares to predict and tell about what's going to happen in the future. It's called prophecy. And it builds my faith to be able to see that God told us 2,500 years ago things that are happening in our news today. It's full-time news. He tells us who Gog and Magog is. He tells us where they're from. Tells us who their allies are going to be. He tells us what's going to happen, and he tells us when it's going to happen. So watch. Ezekiel 38, verses 5 and 6. He lists the nations that come against Israel. Persia, Ethiopia, Libya, with all of them, the shield and the helmet, and Gomer, verse 6, and all his bands, house of Togarmah, of the north quarters. He tells you who they are and where they're from. Now let me give you a little interesting piece. Persia, in 1932, signed a treaty with Russia that would give Russia access to the Middle East through Persia. Now that's interesting. But in 1935, that was in 32. In 1935, Persia changed its name to Iran. Iran is the number one supporter of Hamas against Israel. Are you hearing what I'm saying? Gomer and Togarmah were the sons of Japheth, and they migrated to the areas of Ethiopia, Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, all Arab nations. Now you're back to Ishmael and Isaac. Ishmael was the beginning of the Arab nations. Ezekiel prophesied that they would be allies with Russia in the latter days. Now these are all Arab nations. Now Russia and China today are working to build allies among the Arab nations. If they get control now of the Arab nations, they could cut off a lot of our oil supply. Are you hearing anything that I'm saying? When is all this going to come to pass? Let's see if we can positionize Ezekiel 38 and 39 in relation to a sequence of events that Ezekiel talks about and prophesies. In chapter 37, he talks about the valley. He saw a vision of a valley of dry bones. And they came to life and made an exceeding great and mighty army. Now, in relation to the sequence of events, that would be the rise of Israel again as a nation back in their own land. And Jesus referred to it this way: when you see the budding of the fig tree, that's Israel back in their own land, established as their own nation. He said, the generation that sees that will not pass away until he comes again. Now that happened. A generation can either be 40 years or 100 years in the Bible. So we know it wasn't 40. Now, that happened on May the 14th, 1948. I was 6 years old. Almost 6. A few days before my birthday. So I saw that happen. Now he said that generation or the next 100 years will not pass away until you see the coming of the Lord. That's what Jesus said. You can look it up if you want to. So that's chapter 37. Chapter 40 is what's called the millennial reign, the Sabbath rest. And that's when Jesus comes back, sets up his kingdom on the earth, and rules for 1,000 years or for eternity. So between 37, the valley of dry bones, Israel back in the land, and chapter 40, you have the attack of the armies of the north. You got it positioned in your mind. The attack with the armies of the north will be after Israel is back in the land. It will be before Jesus comes at the end of the 7-year tribulation to set up his kingdom. Now the rapture takes place 7 years before Jesus sets up his kingdom. Have you got it settled in your mind? I lost you again. Chapter 39, verse 9. Israel will burn the weapons left from the war for 7 years. I believe that the armies of the north will take place simultaneously with the rapture of the church. And it will mark the beginning of the 7 years tribulation. Take a breath. Let's get these order of events together in one place. Number one, Israel has got to be back in the land, and they must be established as a nation. That's already happened. Number two, Russia must attack and be turned back and then brought forth again. They will attack, they'll be defeated, and they'll retreat, and they'll come back again. But they're not running the show. That's what God's going to do. He's going to see that it happens. Number three, the armies of the north will be defeated, and the church will be raptured. After the church is gone, there will be 7 years tribulation that begins. Now, the tribulation is in two parts. People get the tribulation mixed up. It's in two parts. It's divided between 3.5 years, 42 months, 1,260 days. The first half. The Antichrist comes on the scene and establishes a one-world leader. He becomes the one-world leader. And that happens now in the middle of the tribulation. What happens is he comes in and protects Israel at first. The one-world leader, the Antichrist. At the middle of the tribulation, the Antichrist is no longer protecting Israel. He turns against them and tries to destroy and kill all Jews. This is what's called the day of Jacob's trouble in the book of Revelation. The day of Jacob's trouble. Last 3.5 years. This is the time that Jesus spoke about when he said, except those days would be shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, the days would be shortened. Now understand, the church is not God's elect. Israel is God's elect. God elected Israel through Abraham and his seed, through which he would bring the Savior. His Son would be born to provide salvation for the world that would accept him. They were God's elect. In fact, God says he was married to Israel. Now, is it possible? Let me wrap up. Is it possible that the stage is being set in the Middle East for the battle of Gog and Magog when God puts hooks in the jaws of the kings of the north and they attack Israel? Is that possible? Is that possible what we're seeing? Is it possible? The stage is being set for the rapture of the church, opening the door for the Antichrist to make his appearance on the stage of history. Is it possible? We could be very close to the coming of the Lord. When the trumpet shall sound, the dead in Christ will rise, and we will be caught up to meet the Lord in the air, so shall we ever be with the Lord. I don't know. I do not know when that's going to happen. Prophetic timing is one thing that God has reserved for himself alone. Even Jesus, when he was in the flesh and walked this earth, said he did not know when it was going to happen. So he didn't know at that time. I don't know when it's going to happen. But I do know this. when the armies of the north move on Israel, I firmly believe the clock is going to begin to tick off the last 7 years of the church age. The tribulation will begin, the church will be raptured, and the tribulation will last 7 years. Now, I don't want to be here. People think, well, I'll just wait till the tribulation and I'll refuse to worship the Antichrist. Dumb. You can't even worship him now. What makes you think you're going to change because the rapture takes place? I am convinced of this as well. When this begin to happen, world events will begin to change with lightning speed. If you're not ready, it's going to be too late. And I mentioned it last week. Noah tried to warn the people. They wouldn't listen. What 100 years of Noah's preaching wouldn't do while he built the ark, God did in about 3 seconds. It had never rained before, and something started happening. The rain began to fall. If you're not saved, it'd be a good time to set your house in order. If you are saved, it'd be a good time to be sure you're where you need to be. A lot of people claiming to be saved, they're not in church anywhere. We got a lot of floaters. They float in, float out. Well, I don't like what Mack said. I don't like what somebody did. Are you in church because of them? Or are you in church because of him? Then don't let someone else take you out of where you're supposed to be. What I say, what someone else does, well, so-and-so hurt my feelings. Well, you ought not to have your feelings out where they could have been hurt. How many know I'm known to hurt feelings? I have a reputation for hurting feelings. I could have some of you stand so everybody else would know who I was preaching to. One last thought. If you are saved and you're not in church somewhere and you're not faithful, then maybe you need to rededicate your life. You need to be where you're supposed to be because there is no grace anyplace else.